Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all. Thank you for joining us. I know that people will continue to join, but I'd like to get started and welcome, first of all, to the third day of this festival. Welcome to this session, which is under the theme Strategies for Change and Resistance. And as we know as we're talking about strategies for change and resistance, we can't do that without talking about the resources and the money. So this session is going to be about really learning from experiences and practices and hearing from activists who have been leaders within the feminist funding space. This session is focused on resourcing feminist struggles, lessons from the past 3 decades. My name is Caroline Twasi-Ama. I am a feminist activist funder activist. Those hats are all very important to me, and I have the pleasure to holding this space. As you know, the South Feminist Futures Festival is a festival, and so it's really important for us to celebrate all different forms of feminist activists, including art. And so we wanted to start the session with sharing of some art by a feminist activist named Joyce Diko Duku, who is a poet from South Sudan. And we'll close the session with another, with a poem from Joa Sabimana, who is a poet from Burundi. So we'll start the conversation with celebration and the celebration of art and the utilization of arts around our activism, and then lead into the conversation. So I think we can show the clip from Joyce, and I'll be back with you all shortly.
You've always been the light. Now it's very dark. Goodbye, humanity. I miss you. I constantly find myself walking around, hoping that maybe you'd come around. The void in my soul is killing me slowly. I search the crowd for your face. How do I find you? How do I find you? And everyone wants to be Zol Kebir at the expense of my skin. Here, where we value some paper, they call money over life. So no surprise, Toronto have no mercy on the little I have. And Yaba can't control his lust. Or is it the girls crazy over Yaba? It's the V8, it's the flashy lifestyle. When hotel is mushroom in crystal is flowering, the city monopolizing the Nile. How do I find you? How do I find you when I live in a who do I know society? When I'm struggling for nothing, how do I find you? How do I find you when my bank statement decreased the respect I deserve? So I have 2 faces, 3 faces, many faces to be fit in this survival war. Empty brains on the front line, manipulated by the cruel, evil-minded who are building empires founded on innocent blood. Woe unto you, full brain, to think you can pop only to be chopped off and used as an example. Lesson, threat, the courage and lifespan is inverse. And to the full brain coward, silence is deadliest. Cruel, evil-minded weapons can't compare. So who's left when courage falls? Is it monuments parading streets named after courage? Or is it courage face hanging on your wall? Or is it courage and just death marked on the calendar? Or is it courage blood sacrificed as ink to write history for you? Who's left when courage falls? I'm in a path, you in it too. We paying for crimes which have made this path unending to a destination, who knows? But I'm hopeful it's like in my dreams, peaceful. I'm honored for me and I honor you for you. Life is precious, every form of it, from me, you to even that plant species getting extinct. It's just but a dream. I awake I miss you. I constantly find myself walking around, hoping that maybe you'd come around. The void in my soul is killing me slowly. I search the crowd for your face. Humanity, I cannot save your face. You cannot save her face. Her face can only be saved by we together. We put aside our differences and make known the impossible to possible. For division has not be the mission, but to feel proud when she has to face the mirror, like the beautiful coloring of the mural, painting every heart, our hearts with colors of love. For it is us to complete the journey of our resting heroines and heroes, us to uphold our responsibility to the unborn generation. We shall unite, and together we'll restore her once upon a time beauty and honor. Let the pain of yesterday wash away in tears. The only way to live today with no fear of tomorrow. Today, forgiving each other. Today, love dwelling in our hearts. We will finally be home. The home that many would pick if she is a flower. Humanity. You taught me to love me for who I am and to love her, him, and it as me. Goodbye. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Joyce. I don't know if Joyce has been able to join the conversation yet, but hopefully Joyce will be able to join us a bit later. And just wanting to share appreciation for that incredibly powerful piece. I think that it brings up the importance of why we're here today. We're talking about change, we're talking about resistance. Resistance exists in many different forms, in many different ways, talking about collective future, of unity, of drawing not only resistance, but the resilience of us as activists, us as a community, and how we're building collective resilience as part of envisioning our futures, as part of walking together. So I wanted to appreciate Joyce, and if Joyce is here, perhaps you can note in the chat, and if also perhaps if the organizers have any additional links or information about this piece or how to get in touch with Joyce, or how to learn more about Joyce's work, they can also include that in the chat so that we can appreciate and be connected. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Caroline Kwasi Ama, and I have the pleasure of holding this space. I'll just talk very quickly about some of the logistics of this meeting, just to highlight before going into the introduction of the panel and introduction of the conversation today. Just to note very quickly, as also is noted in the chat, there is live interpretation in English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese on Zoom. You just, at the bottom of your Zoom link, a Zoom window, there's a place for interpretation. So please pick the language that you would want to hear the conversation in. And so we want this to be a very interactive conversation. And so we encourage people to ask questions in the Q&A box. Ask questions throughout the session. We'll also have time for more interactive question and answers with our panelists. This conversation is being shared also will be recorded for those who are not able to be here, and we encourage people to share on social media. We'll post the links in the chat for the Twitter and Facebook page. If you're sharing, please tag South Feminist Fest. So thank you so much again for being here. As I mentioned today, we are talking in this session, we're talking about resourcing feminist struggles and lessons from the past decade. This is an incredibly important conversation to this broader conversation because we've spent the last few days really laying a context for the work, doing some analysis and sharing. And now we're moving to how do we act? How, what are the different tools that we have? What are the resources that we have to act, to build these feminist futures that we're speaking about within the South Feminist Futures Festival? And I see philanthropy is intrinsically linked to that. So I'm looking forward to hearing from my panel here. And just to appreciate the group that's behind SFF, including the people who you don't see on video, who were a part of making this happen. Also an appreciation for the access to this space through Zoom. It's very open, it's on Facebook Live, it will be recorded. So there's a level of access to these conversations. Interpretation is such a huge part of access to the variety of communities and places in which our communities are. So that appreciation for that. And as we're talking about resourcing and resources of feminist spaces, it's also important to recognize that this didn't happen on its own. And we want to recognize and appreciate the donors who quickly responded to the working group around this idea, including Mama Cash, African Women's Development Fund, Urgent Action Fund Africa, who funded the festival, who came through very quickly in response to the idea and made this happen, including supporting the Zoom platform, interpretation, all of the things that make this space available and possible. Also thanks to Southern Africa Trust, who supported this process as a fiscal host for these resources. So I'd like to talk just very briefly about the context of this conversation. I touched on it, and then I want to introduce the panel. The theme for today, as we know, are strategies for change and resistance. And we know the questions of resources and funding are intrinsically linked to that theme and to that conversation. And as feminist funding organizations, our very existence speaks to the fact that feminists have tried to change how philanthropy is done, to change how our movements are resourced, to change the modalities of resourcing. And we'll hear our panel talk a bit about what that has looked like. Yet at the same time, we're also faced as feminist funding organizations with some of the same challenges that movements are facing, including patriarchy, including sexism, racism, and that is often reproduced within the philanthropic space. So I think we'll also reflect on that. And it's also just to highlight a bit about this session, we are going to be very interactive. We'll have a kind of a guided conversation, more of a talk show style with the panel, and then just open it for questions. So we intend for this conversation to be very interactive. So to briefly introduce my panel before we start the conversation, I'm very pleased, as you can see their lovely pictures in the Zoom video, very pleased to introduce my panels and provide just a brief summary of their bios. Of course, this cannot capture the totality of who they are and what they've contributed to the feminist movement and to feminist philanthropy, but just so you have an idea. So I see, actually it's perfect. Theo, I'll start with you because I see you on video right now. Theo is an independent advisor and consultant, and I would say thought leader specializing in international social development with a particular emphasis on children's rights, a particular emphasis on girls, children's rights, and protection issues in women. She is the current and outgoing CEO of African Women's Development Fund, and her contributions have really been important in terms of providing advisory roles to African and other international organizations working on women and children's rights as an advisor, as a consultant, but also in governance structures. And I think we'll talk about how do we influence these structures, larger foundations. So including roles on the boards and governing structures of Comic Relief, of Stephen Lewis Foundation, Graça Michel Trust, and many others. So we're pleased to have pleased to have Theo here and to hear Theo's experience and perspectives from all of this work. The next person I want to introduce is Zora Moussa, who is currently the executive director of Mama Cash, one of the pioneers within the feminist funding space. Zora came to this role and comes to this space as an activist with academic and professional experience in feminist, anti-racist, queer, and environmental justice movement building in Canada, in the UK, in the Netherlands, and internationally. For those of you who haven't listened to, she didn't mention in her bio that she also is a podcaster, and I highly recommend people to listen to the podcast that Zora has held. I think it's really interesting and brings people into conversations. And she also enjoys dancing and trying new tastes. And I'm really excited to have Zora here as part of the conversation. My third panelist is Rita Thapa, who is founded and led Tewa, and many of us who have been in the philanthropy space have heard about Tewa and the important work that Tewa has done in Nepal. Rita is very much instrumental in that conversation, both as a founder and leader of Tewa from 1995 to 2001. The Nepal Women's Fund and Nagarik Awaz the Peace Building Initiative. She was also the key person who envisioned the Tewa Center, and we'll be talking a little bit about spaces and how we create spaces as feminist funding organizations. And I'm looking forward to hearing about Rita's contribution in that space. So developing from the idea to the development between 2011 and 2017. She's been a key leader within peace building spaces and peace building conversations in Nepal and internationally. And her training and ongoing practice has been around women's advancement, local philanthropy, and peace building. In addition, she also chairs the board of the Global Fund for Community Foundation. So very excited to hear about Rita's experience and perspective within local philanthropy. Finally, last but certainly not least, is Jean Kamitari, who is a Ugandan feminist working for the Urgent Action Fund Africa as the programs director. Jean comes with a very extensive experience within gender equality and gender-based violence work. Many of you probably know Jean from her work as the GBV Prevention Network, coordinating the GBV Prevention Network, which has really spanned across the continent, across multiple continents when she was at Raising Voices, and at Urgent Action Fund Africa, she is responsible for the strategic leadership and program implementation. So very excited to also hear from Jean about the experience and those perspectives garnered over the past decade or so. So thank you very much for the panel, for being here. Thank you for all of you for being here too. And I also want to make a special thank you to Hope Chigudu, whose face you are not seeing in this video, but it has been very, very present in this conversation, including pushing me to moderate this session. But, you know, and I think it's very much her style of creating spaces for a lot of different feminist activists to be in these places and to hold these conversations. So thank you, Hope, for the genesis of this panel and for all of that you do, even when it's behind the scenes. So I want to get started. And my first question to the panel is around learning. We're talking about learnings from the last 3 decades of feminist funding. And so I'd like to hear from you a very big picture and real reflection from the different places in which you sit. What do you see as the key lessons that we've learned as feminist funding organizations about this architecture of the global and local women's financing architecture? What are the things that we've learned? What are the things that we've been seeing in this field? And I'd like to start with Zora around this question and then open it up to the rest of the panel.
Thanks. I'll maybe share 2 lessons because I think there's probably a lot we could say, each of us. The first thing I would say is that there is a kind of lack of resources, and so it is necessary to get more resources into the system for us, but more money isn't always better money. So more money matters for sure, but the kind of money also really matters. So if we have a lot of money coming in that goes against our agendas or that is forcing us to go into work, that's not our priority. That's also a problem. In addition, the report that we just worked on with AWID which is looking at the kind of way money flows in the ecosystem, shows that we can talk about more money needing to come in, but actually the way the money flows is super important. So the money that is already floating in the system isn't reaching feminists and isn't reaching women's rights organizations. So we actually need to pay attention to that. The money that does exist to work on women's rights or gender equality or whatever that is, where's it going? And then the third thing I would say is that this isn't by accident. The fact that money doesn't flow to the agendas that feminists are articulating is by design. It's not by accident. There's an intentional effort to fund counter efforts, to fund things that are actually going against feminist agendas and that are distracting from our work and that are attacking us as women human rights defenders, for example. And so it's important to also pay attention to that the kind of effort to redistribute and rebalance funding to make sure that feminists have the money that we need to advance our causes, that's a question of justice. It's not a charity project. So when we're thinking about mobilizing resources as in the women's funding movement, for example, so we have the panelists here are all from what we call women's funds. That's social justice work. That's not trying to get help for women's rights issues. It's not charity work.
Thank you very much, Zora, for that. And I think this, you pointed to a thread that I think we'll be discussing throughout this of not all money is good money, and it's not only a question of more money, but it's also the how. And I was just reflecting. I remember a lot of the conversation around some of the new sources of funding, including the Equality Fund. AWDF, African Women's Development Fund, was really behind a lot of that. And not just that, but even Amplified Change Fund, ensuring that the kind of money was the money that was supporting movements. And so I'm wondering, Theo, if you can talk also, if you have reflections on this question of, what are we learning as feminist funding organizations about global and local women's financing architecture? What are some of the lessons that you've learned? What are some of the things that you've seen?
So I agree with Zora a lot, actually, about not all money is good money. And that there is so much and so many lessons that we've learned. I was actually raging in my office last night with Francoise, the new CEO at AWDF, about one of the partnerships that I will not mention which one that we been in, where we've learned a lot of lessons. So I'm going to stop raging. I've decided raging isn't helping me today. But what I would say, the type of partnership you enter into makes a real difference. And the best funding partnerships that we've managed to be a part of are those where we can guarantee shared feminist values. Because then when you hit the other road bumps that you hit in partnerships, you have something that you can all hold on to as you move forward. So I think that one of the roles of women's funds that Zora was talking about really has been almost to absorb the conditionalities that external funders put on us, so that when the money gets to feminist groups, it gets to the movements can use the money more flexibly, more constructively, and for their agendas entirely. But it means that women's funds have real fights to fight in order to make sure that that money in some way comes through constructively. I think the other thing that we've been finding at AWDF is that we have to be agile and we have to be flexible and we have to fight the fight. We have to be prepared to push back at all times. And sometimes that's been fantastic. And partnerships like Leading from the South have shown us that you can negotiate and move forward and get the kind of partnership and funding that you want into the movement, and that pushing back can make a change. But it's also taught us that it's extremely tiring, and you need to be in solidarity with other feminists in order to maintain that energy to move forward. And I think the last thing I'll talk about, so that other people can talk about, is that, you know, with or without money, our movements work and our movements will go ahead. And that's something that some of the funding actors really need to understand, that our feminist agendas are independent agendas. And yes, we need money. And yes, the money can help increase volume, increase profile. But with or without that money, we are going to struggle. We are going to fight the good fight. And so the funders need to understand that they need to work with us and not try to co-opt us. And when that happens, you get partnerships that you can really work with. But that message about whose agenda it is, whose struggles they are, that's something that we need to constantly keep pushing, so that whether you're a bilateral funder or a philanthropic funder or an individual giver, that you understand that this is about solidarity. You know, as Zora said, it's not charity.
Thank you so much, Theo, for that. And I'm wondering if Rita and Jean also have points they want to add around this point. I think this is an important thread, and I think there's a conversation also in the chat from Hope around pushing back is great, but we need a critical mass to push back with us. So I don't know if Jean and Rita have other thoughts around lessons learned and even this point that's been raised about pushing back and how have we pushed back, how have we resisted?
Yeah, I think I'll share my thoughts, starting with the one big lesson that we are looking at, the rhetoric around increased interest and investment in women's rights, girls' rights, does not necessarily translate into direct funding for women. If you look at AWID's reports, there's a lot of funding, but how much is it going for feminist activism, which has been proven over time to actually be responsible for the transformations that we have so far, even if we still need much more. So coming to the point of the critical mass to push back, I think we are learning that, first of all, we have a role to play in challenging and changing the dynamics, the power dynamics within the funding philanthropic architecture. And we're also learning to be conscious around the fact that as women's funds, we are part of a feminist ecosystem of funding that holds a lot of power in pushing back, and what are our comparative advantages so that we can come together and create that critical mass for pushing back. I think the critical mass begins with us who are already within the funding architecture, putting our strengths together and pushing back. But yes, we do need a critical mass.
Thank you, Jean. Rita, do you have other thoughts around this? Or the experiences you want to share from your experience building being a part of this space for
Yeah, thank you, Carolyn. Maybe I can just chip in quickly by demonstrating a long time back, you know, what we did with Tewa was I didn't go to external donors here, and Nepal, you know, is a very independent country, and even our toilets are now being made by donors, taking the power away from the communities. And so I chose to go only to feminist funds and funders because I didn't want the credit of doing Tewa, even without knowing what it was, to lie with foreign aid agencies, because I think fundamentally they are flawed, and unless they look into their structures of how to have more trust, respect, and responsibility, those are not only of value to the receiving partners, if they can be partners, but they are equally important to also the donors who give with the same trust, respect, and responsibility. And that is responsibility, meaning some engagement, some understanding of the context. And with the existing hierarchies, the North-South dynamics, usually it's very, very difficult to have that. So yes, basically, I will echo what you have said, that our work will go on with or without. It'll be smart for them to come on board with us on an equal footing with respect, trust, and responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Rita. I actually wanted to follow up on what you talked about, Rita, and I'm wondering if you can share with us what that experience has been. I know that really building this local philanthropy has been such a big part of the journey of Tewa and your journey and your leadership. And I think it's an important example of how, as feminist funders, as feminist funding organizations, we're shaping, challenging, transforming some of the ways in which philanthropy works. And so maybe would love for you to elaborate more about, how that experience has been, and also if you've seen a ripple effect in terms of how funders are engaging with you, how they're engaging with the movements that you are part of and movements that you work. Have you also seen an impact in terms of the field?
Thank you. I'd love to. And basically, the interesting thing is, although to run a very, very meager organization, we took money from feminist funds and donors, feminist donors, but every penny of the grant making money we raised locally with an overwhelmingly growing number of individual donors. They did not come from the corporate sector. We tried, but we all know where that is. So we didn't have the energy to spend, and I wanted to make a leadership transition ideally in 5 years. So basically, everybody said I couldn't do it. Everybody said you can't do it, because Nepal is an aid-dependent country, and although philanthropy exists very much through cultural and religious giving money for women's empowerment, hello. I mean, that was wild, especially 25 years back. So, Zora is here, so Marianne Sachs, the Global Fund for Women, on whose board I sat at the time with Marianne. So these kind of people, not to mention also Hope, people like that. So we were very much, just the way we needed that love, that sisterhood, that understanding, and that trust. Because before I even conceptualized Tewa, on that panel in Huairu, Beijing, I mean, hurriedly, Anforth Murray was saying, we'll give you money if you're really going to do this. And I came to Nepal, quit my job with the UN, and began. So 25 years back. So, it was very hard, but at the same time, being persistent, consistent in order to develop trust where trust is lacking, especially for the NGOs in Nepal. So, all these things took a lot of time, but we did it.
Thank you so much, Rita. What I'm hearing here is also that it takes time. it takes time to build these relationships. It takes time to build the kind of change that we want to see in the sector, in the way that people are used to engaging with philanthropy. I think that, and also I think the thing that jumped out to me in what you were saying was also trust, that you had the initial partners who trusted in your vision and trusted in your leadership. And I think trust is sometimes something we don't hear enough in philanthropy. So I'm wondering, especially as global South-based funds, and this is my experience also at ISDAO, that often the default from Global North is question and not trust. So I'm curious as to experiences from other colleagues on the call around other experience, any reflections in response to what Rita was sharing, but also any other experiences you want to share about how you've been able to challenge some of these predominant systems of philanthropy or ways of working within this field, because this is a field that also reproduces so much of what we have in society around power, around racism, around sexism, et cetera. So, any response, I guess it's multifold. So any responses or reflections also in response to the points that Rita was making, but also any other thoughts around this. It's open.
Everyone is shy.
Sorry, and Jean, I realized I asked like 3 questions in that one question. So really whatever resonates with you. I mean, I think it's just really important within this conversation. We often talk about, the things at the end, right? What after something happens. So, if there are the reflections from ways in which you've seen, or Urgent Action Fund Africa, or, Mama Cash AWDF, that you've been able to challenge these conversations around philanthropy, able to challenge these dynamics and the modalities around how funding, how resourcing for feminist movements is happening. Anything that you wanted to share?
Well, I'll start with the fact that change starts with you. So change starts within. We are all funders. And so that dynamic doesn't exist. It's not something that we are divorced from if we are not deliberate about focusing on the values, feminist values, social justice values. And within the Urgent Action Fund's sisterhoods, we've been reflecting, and we base our work on core principles that include listening, or basing on trust, principles of trust in women, trans, and gender non-conforming movements, being interrogative of diverse power dynamics. So as I mentioned, that we are not divorced from it, so that taking the time to reflect on diverse power dynamics between us and the communities and movements that we work with, and between us and other funders that support our work. We are conscious of and driven by the politics of care and protection, because we are aware of the challenges that the individuals and groups within the movements we serve are. We are deeply political about money, and that means we consciously unpack how we are dealing with money and with the people that we support. We look at grant making beyond financial, but we look at it as part of accompaniment and linking, working with the movements that we support and the women human rights defenders that are part of our movements. But I think the main point I wanted to bring out was starting with ourselves if we want to transform philanthropy, as we are talking about, basing it on feminist values, unpacking power dynamics, and also engaging more consciously in philanthropic advocacy, not just for bringing in huge pots of money, but also transforming the dynamics with which the whole philanthropic architecture operates.
Thank you,
Caroline,
Jean.
so
Yes,
maybe
please.
if I add to that, I've been trying, I've been trying to think about how to be positive about your question.
But I think it's perfectly okay to not be, because that's also real.
Well, because honestly, the truth of the matter is that what you're saying is what we face every day. With AWDF, even from its first formation, the three African women who pulled who dreamt up AWDF and established it, Bisi Adole, Fayemi, Joanna Foster, and Hilda Tadria. And I always want to mention their names because we should remember our African women philanthropists as well. But they started it because they were tired. They were tired of going to these funders who would say to them, oh, you shouldn't be working on advocacy and changing policy. You should be working on giving bread to women who are hungry. And they were, people who'd never stepped foot on our continent. And even though that was almost 20 years ago, it continues. So it's almost like the default when you go in is mistrust, that most people are, no matter what the rhetoric is, what lies behind it, very openly in some situations, but in others in a much more hidden way, you know that you're going in and you're going to have to reframe their thinking. You're going to have to reframe their expectations. You're going to have to make them understand that they should be respecting you and respecting the work and respecting the agenda. And that's why I was saying earlier that when you're working in solidarity with other feminists and other feminist funds, that becomes a little easier because you can take it in turns. Somebody does the hard work one day, steps back to breathe, while another partner comes in and continues to push. I really, really think that when we work together, we actually can get further. But I don't fool myself. There are some amazing people working in some of the bodies that we actually work with. But we really do need to remember that these are patriarchal structures. It's not about the individuals that you're working with. It's about how the system is structured and what the system drives in terms of beliefs and therefore actions. And so we do absolutely need to work with the individuals within those systems to help us change those systems, but we shouldn't get fooled. We absolutely should not be fooled about the fact that this is a constant struggle.
Thank you, Theo. And that point around looking at the bigger system, and also Jean's point around the work we need to do inside within our institutions, brings me a bit to Zora, because I know Mama Cash has made a transition, or is making a transition, to rethinking how you're doing your work and doing more participatory grant making, participatory approaches, which I think is a shift. And hopefully we'll also see more, especially global North donors follow suit. But I'm wondering if you can share a bit about what that journey internally has been, and how do you see that as a potential contribution? Do you see that as a potential contribution to this shifting the systems and the ways of grant making that Theo is speaking to?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's helpful that you name it as a contribution. So it's not going to solve problematic power dynamics, right? That's a broader systems problem, but it's a tool, it's a contribution. So Mama Cash's grant making has always involved activists in the decision-making process, and we're trying to shift that power dynamic further. We're trying to upend it further, so that all of our decisions ultimately about which grants we make and who it goes to is led by activists rather than staff. It's a process we've been in for a couple of years. We've piloted it with a couple of our portfolios, so particular funds already in the last few years, and we're moving that from 2021 all of our, I'm trying not to jinx it because there's still a lot of work to do, but that all of our grant making decisions will be led by activists rather than staff. And I have to say two things about that. One is that we aren't the forerunners on that, right? There are many participatory grant makers that we've been learning from. So we talked to 11 different ones just in our process of learning how we might do this and what's worked for them, what's not worked for them. And we really, we follow in the paths laid down by UHI and so on that have been doing this for many years and from their inception. But the other thing to say is that as far as we know, we're the only grant maker of our size and kind of sort of breadth of geographic diversity, depth of thematic issues, and just size that's ever attempted this. So it is a work in progress. We do see it as a contribution to shifting that, but I would say also to try to start to answer Amina Mama's question around, what else can we be doing in terms of feminist economic justice strategies? And something I know that Theo talks a lot about also is how do we maintain or increase our autonomy as feminist movements and as women's funds? And that's about who's funding us. So we try to do this thing where we're absorbing the conditionalities of the funding that we're receiving and trying to make that useful for the movements we're supporting. But also, it would be great if we could also have much more support from women supporting feminist movements. And so really moving towards trying to recognize that women's funds roles as movement builders, as supporting movement building, is about movement building around philanthropy. So building a broad base of people, certainly women, who are supporting feminist movements by giving. Some people give time, some people go out on the street, some people are writing petitions, some people are doing advocacy. Some people need to be giving the resource they have, which is money. And so really looking at that as another part of the kind of work that Women's Fund's doing. Women's Fund's mobilize resources, and we've talked a lot about trying to get it from patriarchal structures and harder to reach donors. But there's another piece that Women's Funds do, which is talking to individuals about why it matters that we support social justice causes that are important to us, and that there are different ways of supporting, and one of those ways is to give money.
Thank you, Zora. You also spoke to a question that came in the chat from Amina Mama. So I'm going to bring this to the group because I think it ties into my next question around beyond grant making. What is the contribution that we're making? What are the roles? We're talking about a broader feminist movement ecosystem, and resourcing is through grant making is one part, but there's many other also ways in which we're contributing. So I want us to state the question to enable interpretation of the question, and then share it with the panel in case you have reflections around this question, and any other reflections around contributions beyond grant making and the philanthropic advocacy that you're doing. So the question from Amina Mama is, beyond feminist grant making and commendable philanthropic advocacy that is generously educating donors, what other economic justice strategies are likely to support the creation of anti-capitalist alternative economic spaces? Specifically, how might we leverage African women to cash in on the African free trade area? So I'm wondering if others have thoughts around that question, specifically, or any thoughts broadly around how, as we think about the bigger struggles, resourcing, the grant making that we do is one part, other contributions that you see your organizations or the organizations you're connected to making within the broader feminist social justice struggles.
Okay, so let me jump in briefly with a bit of a cop-out. Amina, thank you for the question. And I should have known that you would ask the difficult question. No, but I think that what you're saying is really important. But I also think that one of the things about women's funds is that in my head, we really are almost like the money arm of the movement. I always think that the really important thing that we can do is provide activists and movements with the resources to do the actual work. So, where we can support feminist economists and feminist macroeconomists. And we've got some fabulous African women who've set up organizations or are working together to really look at changing those macroeconomic spaces. That our job is to get them the money and, where possible, facilitate access to spaces and to whether it's decision-making spaces or thought-provoking spaces or thought leadership spaces for them to actually do their work properly, rather than us as women's funds trying to step into that role. I think that the point that you're making about the other work that women's funds do is important, because part of making the resources available is the issue about accompaniment and being able to work with our movements and with women's feminist organizations who can say to us, what we need now is X. And for us to be able to walk with them as we all try to get to X. I can't tell you about how we can leverage African women's use or mobilization of the Africa free trade area. I don't know enough about it, but I do know that as AWDF, we can fund those of our sisters who are active in these areas to be able to work out what as movements we should be doing and to tell us what they feel that we should be doing. But I do think that you're absolutely right. We have to go beyond grant making and philanthropic advocacy. And part of that for us is walking alongside and learning and listening and continually adapting our work to better meet the needs and the demands of our movements.
Thank you, Theo, for that. I wanted to just invite Jean and Rita, if you have any other thoughts on this. And then I have one last question, and then I want to open it up because I see we have a number of questions from the audience, and I want to make sure we have enough time for those conversations. So in terms of just building on Theo's point, ways in which as feminist funding organizations, we're supporting the movements that we're a part of and that we contribute to beyond the direct grants that we make.
Yeah,
So,
maybe Jean, go ahead.
All right, thank you. So similarly to Theo, for us, we look at support to the feminist movements that we are part of and that we serve beyond grant making. So accompaniment, we look at providing financial, political, and technical resources. So beyond the grants, we have accompaniment as quite a major strategy of ours, be it convening spaces, like Theo has mentioned, and in response to Professor Amina, convening spaces where maybe we could get economists and other feminist activists to sit, reflect, and strategize, and then decide what kind of activities are appropriate, and we fund those. That's one. Also, linking is one of the main strategies that we attach to our solidarity and support work with the movements. And this is linking, because we are a rapid response catalytic fund, it means our funds catalyze an action, but then we need to link to other funders like those on this call to take that catalytic action further. So beyond grant making and philanthropic advocacy, we also work hand in hand with the movements, providing spaces through convenings for reflection and action, providing spaces for care and healing, because we have learned the challenges that come with burnout and exhaustion and wanting to sustain the movement, and also linking our partners to other groups, funds that can take the catalytic action that we've funded further. In terms of the African free trade area, I'm also not an economic expert on this, but I feel like a lot of linking is required with unpacking this, because it may not be automatic that if you open and remove all barriers and do not protect women in certain economies, that then they will benefit. It might serve the same capitalistic neoliberal purposes. So certainly a lot of thinking is required and support to feminist economists to unpack the implications of this free trade area and how women, especially women in the informal sector, are going to benefit from this. And also cross-movement working, because we can't address issues of economic justice when other justices, environmental and other justices, are not addressed, because they are all hinged on the same oppressive systems of neoliberalism, capitalism, racialism, you name it.
Yeah, maybe I can jump in
Mhm.
and, just exemplify in Nepal, like for the last 30 years, almost as long as Tewa has been, it's like we've gone through, say, several people's movement, and then the 10-year-long armed conflict, a very unstable post-conflict transition, and 14 years to be exact, I think. And now earthquake simultaneously, that was 7.3 Richter scale earthquake, devastating 1/3 of Nepal. And then now the COVID. And I've seen through my peace building work as well that, we pay attention to first track diplomacy, getting the conflicting groups on the table, but we pay no attention to women in any of these situations where they are the ones who are holding the safety net, including COVID-19 period for all of us. They are the ones who are holding families together, children together. They are the ones who are facing multiple violences. And, they have the responsibility of holding it all together for all of us. And I think, therefore, what you said about the need for us to also resource women. I know that when the Constituent Assembly, we brought out and the elections happened. So 40% of the women at the local level are in our governments now. So for the first time in Nepal's history, they have that space, which is significant, but this is at the rural level. And quite a number of those are from Tewa grantee groups. So had that not happened, it would not have happened. So the fact that there's this ongoing support throughout Nepal, may be very meager financial support, but the more is, and what Hope has been putting on chat, it's about building relationships. That's the only way trust happens. But in that relationship is a lot of love and care. And I think that's what happened when I got on the board of the Global Fund for Women early on, among feminist funders and donors. That trust would not have happened without love. And I think that's a key ingredient to building trust and relationships. Yeah.
Thank you, Rita. I hear the echoing of love, of trust, being really critical in our work of resourcing, even resourcing as a tool, not only for the direct work of organizations and organizing, but resourcing of spaces for these conversations, such as this one, but others as being really key. So I want to just, there's been a number of questions that come in through the chat, and I want to encourage, and I'm mindful of our time, so I actually want to shift to the questions that have been asked. And I'll start with the questions. Maybe could start just also for translation, for interpretation purpose, reading some of the questions and comments, and encourage that as much as possible, if we can use the Q&A function for questions going forward, that will help us to keep track, because we don't want to lose any of the valuable contributions and questions that have been raised. So the first, when we've gotten comments in the chat around how what has been said really resonates. There's a comment from the South Asia Women's Fund India, completely resonate with the things that Rita was saying. There's politics behind resourcing for feminist movement, as feminist funds were responsible and accountable to the movements that we're a part of. So if and when we deny funds, we are turning down the opportunity for thousands of women groups in taking that decision. So it's framed as a statement, but I'm hearing a question there around, navigating the difficult decision of saying no, and what are then the implications for the thousands of women's groups that would have benefited from that opportunity. So I think that's one question, and I just want to read perhaps two other questions and invite the panel to respond. There's a question around the context and the environment of the work and the struggle for funding. What haven't we done to make funders understand? Why are we having to chase after money and funders? I think that's, there was a comment from Hope. It's perhaps less of a question and really more of a statement and a response, but I don't know if others have thoughts around that. There's a point here around from Nancy around the Nigeria Feminist Coalition. In the earlier session, we mentioned the Nigeria Feminist Coalition and how they mobilized resources to support the NSARS movements. What's the potential for raising local resources with the new digital platforms, and how can we use those more? Should we? So I think we could maybe start with those and do a round of reflections and contributions, and invite the panel if there are particular questions or statements that resonate with them that they want to respond to in that first round. And it's open.
Okay, Caroline, I'll jump in. I feel like I'm jumping in too much, guys. But just to come back to the point about digital platforms, I think that what happened in Nigeria was absolutely fantastic, and that leadership shown by who not only worked together, but then pulled together other movements to really work not just on NSTARS, but to actually raise some of the wider issues in terms of feminist agendas was absolutely amazing. And I think it's great that they were able to raise resources from some digital platforms. I think the important thing for us is looking at all of these multiple ways of resource mobilization, and the use of digital platforms are absolutely crucial. However, I think we also should look at the way in which organizations like TIWA manage to mobilize resources from a whole range of actions, because not all African women have got access to digital technology and platforms. We have increasing numbers, and in some countries more than others. So I think we need to use that where it's available, but to be really thoughtful and inclusive of ways in which we can work with other African women to really mobilize resources, financial, thought resources, other types of resources as well. But I think your core point of going beyond simply getting institutional funding and then making grant making is a really important point, and it's something that we need to work on a lot, but also to know that it's not always that easy, because a lot of the digital platforms raise quite small amounts of money, and you need to really build that up over a period of time if we're talking about resourcing movements. But again, independent money like that, really, really valuable, helpful.
Thank you. Anybody else want to jump in? And we have about, I've been told we have about 15 minutes left. There are maybe about 3-4 other questions. So I wanted to invite, if there's any of the questions that have been raised already that anyone wants to also contribute on.
No, I'm only building on the fact that, I mean, I like the question. It pushes us to think about creative ways of raising money that are not the traditional ways that we think about. And I'm talking about many more than women's funds, even women's rights organizations. And I'm reflecting on discussion we've been having with Ethiopian partners over the last 10 years. They've raised funding from individuals because they were not, as you all know, allowed to receive funding. So they've raised money and operated. Organizations like Ethiopian Women Lawyers Association, the Yellow Movement, have raised money from individuals within Ethiopia and continued operating, and raised time resources from women who have volunteered their time to continue giving services, engaging in advocacy. And they've been able to continue their movement building for the past 10 years without that. So it also pushes us to reflect creatively. Back to the point of not everyone can access digital technologies in order for that digital fundraising to work. However, the whole point, I think, is on being creative and diversifying what we see as our sources of funding.
I don't know if I can share something about what you asked earlier, Caroline, or are you going to ask that later about have we said no to funders?
I think it would be great if you want to talk about that, because I don't know if we'll have time to come back to that, but I think it would be great to hear your thoughts about that.
Like just to exemplify, so that with Oxfam, so this is when I was in Nagarikawas, because that's when we looked for, and Oxfam wanted to support us. So we worked through about 9 months of really working through this proposal, 9 months before finally the signing date came. And when that time came, I had gone with my program officer and my finance officer. And they called in this officer there, he called in my program officer and said, but 40% of this money needs to go to drinking water and sanitation. And this was for conflict affected youths. So of course, I mean, we were there ready to sign the paper. So Bikram came out and shared this, and I said no. I wrote immediately to this head of the Oxfam office in Nepal, but I'm saying, yeah, I mean, it's as blatant as that, because within these systems, I don't know if this is all pervasive, but patriarchy and corruption. It's clearly that, because then we'd have to commission that part of the work to the contractor they chose, because we have no idea. We haven't talked with our communities to see if they want drinking water even. So, things like that, yeah, happen all the time and continue to even now.
And if I can just jump in with that, because I saw that question, and I think it's really hard for us sometimes as women's funds, you know, when we do have to walk away, because we're thinking of exactly that. You're thinking the movements need this money. The organizations can really usefully use this money. And even we as organizations, as women's funds, need the money. But then sometimes the conditions that are linked, the things that people are asking us for, you know, actually actively undermine our core principles and values. So that if we take that money, actually, we are doing the opposite of supporting our movements. And there have been a few um, discussions and money that we have been negotiating, where at the end of the day, we've had to say, you know what, no, and walk away. And sometimes it's been painful, especially when you needed that money. But at the end of the day, I don't think that the movements will thank us for bringing in money that actually constrains our agendas rather than supports the agendas. But it's really hard, and it's a very, very fine line. And I'm not sure that we get on the that we're on the right side of the line all of the time. It's something that we have to work at. And in the um, paper that Mama Cash and AWID just put out about funding feminist movements, one of the lines I most appreciated was the one that talked about organizations, including women's funds, trying to access good funding and good money for our movements, but not always getting it right, because we don't always get it right, but we do have to take some of those risks sometimes. And so walking away sometimes can be really, really brave.
Yeah, maybe I can come in there to say yes. Also for us, we've had to sometimes walk away from funding, and we do get approached sometimes by funders, and it's a very tricky position also because we're approached because of our access. We are based in the global north, we are well known, we are larger. So often the kind of new to women's rights funding people will come to Mama Cash. And it's a very difficult conversation sometimes because they're so enthusiastic, they really want to do something, but it can be performative, and it can be, you know, they want to look good, but the funding itself is problematic. It's not going to serve our interests ultimately. And Mama Cash taking it helps, you know, that donor's image look really good, but it hurts our movements and it harms our agendas. So that's a tricky thing to navigate for sure. And definitely we don't always get it right. It's, you know, there's not a scientific calculation about it. It's a judgment call. And there are different things to think about in that. I think another part of it I would want us to think about also is this idea about for what are we raising the resources? So there's the part about what kind of funding do we take and how do we maximize our autonomy? So the sources of the funding, right? So when we get it from individuals, often it's with less conditions. And that's why it's really important to be people-backed rather than institution-backed, because people-backed gives us more autonomy. But also, for what are we mobilizing those resources? And this point that came up in the comments around the amount of work we're doing to cover for the state, the amount of safety net work we're doing. And Rita, you were talking about sort of disaster relief work, right? That we end up doing as feminist movements. So for what are we mobilizing those resources? We're raising money for problems that shouldn't exist, and that certainly we shouldn't be taking care of to fix. And so the effort to mobilize resources is also about mobilizing support for the cause, for the agenda, for the point, for the value of women and women's status and women's rights. And I think we can talk about the technique. Do we go digital? Do we go door to door? You know, what's the way to get to different kinds of people to mobilize that support? But the point is, we're trying to mobilize support for a cause. And money is the way people demonstrate support for the cause, a way. There's other ways, time, knowledge, so on. But money is one of the ways people demonstrate, and that's not necessarily just by amount, right? It's about how much that means to the person. Somebody giving €5 could mean a lot to them. Someone giving €5,000 could mean a lot to them, or could mean nothing to them, right? So it's about kind of what are they giving? And as we build support for the cause by many, right? So many people supporting, even if it's many people giving less, that shows a power of consensus. That's building a broader consensus about women's rights being important to our communities and societies. So even though ultimately getting a couple of donations that are really large really helps us as women's funds, I'll be honest, right? When we get those big donations, that's a big deal. We can do a lot with that. But when we get a lot of little contributions, lower value contributions, but from many people, that shows us that we're backed. Our agenda is back. There's a growing consensus. And why that matters is then we can approach governments and talk about how that's public money. When we're taking money from governments and from states and rechanneling that into feminist movements, I go back to the point about this is not charity, it's justice. That is public money that should be going for public goods, and women's rights are a public good. So the more we can build this consensus, this common consensus, we can also go back to some of these donors and say, you should be funding this. This is important to society. And you can have a different kind of conversation than when you are then negotiating with governments and those conditionalities. And you have a different power base from which to then do that negotiation about, do you walk away or not walk away? How much can you push? How far can you push?
Thank you so much, Zora. And this ties into, I just wanted to note, we have about 5 minutes, and then there's another artistic presentation that we'll do to close. So I just wanted to note the kind of 3 other questions and threads that I think tie to this conversation about the roles and how do we navigate our roles. So I want to bring those up and just invite the panelists, any reflections on this. There's a question around, grant making and participatory and power shifting, around money, around decision making. But then connected to that, more feminist and women's rights organizations are becoming intermediaries for funding. So not necessarily funding organizations such as those that we're a part of, but other feminist organizations and women's rights organizations are directly becoming intermediaries. How do we, the feminist principles of grant making and accountability are not easily accessible, available, and the role of grant administrator and those patriarchal norms dominate their approach. So how do we support a wider understanding of feminist principles for feminist organizations to also adopt the principles? So as we're talking about feminist principles, feminist funding principles, how do we ensure that there's a wider engagement within feminist organizations who are now receiving funds directly as intermediaries? So that's the first question. Another question is around if any of the panelists would like to share thoughts around funding as an aspect of as a particular aspect of the broader issue of coalition building. So that's a question of funding as part of coalition building, if I understand the question correctly. And then the third kind of question or point is around mobilizing local resources. We need to deal with the myths around African philanthropy, which is invisibilized, and notions that Africans are not givers. How do we strengthen African feminist giving across finances, skills, resources, time, etc.? So that's kind of a third bucket of questions. So I just want to invite the panel, if you have any reflections on or responses to any of those 3 questions that have been asked.
I'll jump in and get before Q. So yeah, I know she will otherwise. No, I think I'll pick up the one around coalition. Without that, I mean, none of our work is possible, and we've done that all along. But recently, what may be of interest to you in terms of COVID-19 is we are trying to create community safety net and have some of the key grantees of TEWA and partners of other organizations work in their communities to develop this safety net around issues of food security, health security and safety, violence, an issue they choose, but by mobilizing local, because in these times travel is difficult. So to be realistic, so what Nepal always had, and I'm sure Africa has, like our own communities, but still we know that with modernization, urbanization, processes of globalization, we are those communities are disintegrating, and the safety net that they lay within that is breaking down. So if we can rebuild this, but using our women activists and leaders as the focal point. So right now we are working on that. So it is a kind of a coalition building, because unless we all work in and through our communities, I don't think we can do anything. So it is for the larger community. Yeah.
All right.
Just to invite everybody else to last like 1 minute max, because I've been told we really need to wrap up. So yes, please, Jean.
1 minute, I'll talk about African philanthropy. It's true that it's a myth, because if we look at other sectors, for example, look at the money that goes to churches, mosques, the money that is given in that form, it's a lot of money. It's really a lot of money. So it's true. I think I go back to the point that was made about movement building and having us connect, and us I'm talking about more broadly, people connect to the issues and connect to the movements, because it's possible. I mentioned Ethiopia. We've had a lot of stories coming out of Ethiopia, 10 years financing from the people itself. It is possible. And I think we just need to get creative and really study these models. For example, what makes you give 1/10 of your salary to the church when you know what it's going to be used for? No offense meant, but so that connection is something that we need to get good at creating, so that this philanthropy that's going to churches and other houses of worship can also move into the feminist movement.
And Caroline, if I just follow up with that,
Yes.
Again, it is a total myth about African philanthropy. Not being there and not being strong. But I actually think the word philanthropy has been hijacked by an elite population in both South and North. So people think philanthropy and they think Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. And yet you look at what happened in East and Southern Africa when a whole generation of parents were wiped out by HIV/AIDS, and grandmothers in villages adopted not just their own grandchildren or their neighbors' grandchildren, but children in other villages. And these were women who had very little. They weren't giving from the margins, they were giving from the core. And that is not new. That is generations of Africans. So we need to do something more about documenting what we do and what we do well. I agree that there's a connection issue, Jean, that we have to get right and be able to persuade people to give more into some of our social movements financially, but we do get a lot of giving in other ways. But we really have to destroy that myth. And that's why Urgent Action Fund Africa and AWDF are part of the African Philanthropy Network, because we need to change that narrative, because the narrative about African philanthropy being weak or non-existent is not true.
Zora, you have the last 30 seconds. If there's anything you want to add.
Nothing. I cannot.
Okay. It's hard. It's a hard, Theo, that was a hard act to follow. I think that's it. So, I mean, I think the important point is that this conversation is starting. This very conversation is being recorded, documented, that we talk about the need to document, the need to have these conversations. The South Feminist Futures Festival is, I understand there's documentation happening. There's a lot of questions that we weren't fully able to unpack, but I understand that this is a part of a broader conversation. This is a start of a conversation that will be continuing next year. And I think so there will be we'll continue as a community to have conversations about these really critical questions. So I just wanted to thank everyone who came. Before closing, just invite, we have an artistic presentation of a poem, and I just wanted to thank, first of all, the panel, such an incredible panel, so much wisdom and experience. I'm glad we got the chance to talk about when we say no and how we've said no. We need to talk a lot more about that. So I'm looking forward to future conversations that we can have within the context of the South Feminist Futures Festival. So I wanted to just invite the organizers to present the artistic presentation, please.
So I named this one Fuck It. Here it goes. Freedom is a thing of the heart. It is a smile stretched in the face of difficulty. It often comes with a sense of flying over obstacles that previously seemed insurmountable. Freedom is the inner knowing that forces larger than yourself are pulling and pushing mountains to make the path smoother for your gentle feet. It is also not knowing the future with exactitude and finding laughter in not knowing. It is the gratitude and excitement of the now. But I wouldn't know anything about that, would I? To me, the world is only what I see when I look outside my window. Big Man said freedom is for the weak, and the world outside is crude. He keeps me locked in, says the world would hate me if they really knew my soul. This is for your protection, he says, before locking my room with a triple combination lock. Big Man says I will never lack anything with him by my side. He brings me food and new clothes every day. He says I should be grateful. Half the world doesn't eat as much as I do, and more than half the world doesn't have new clothes to change into. Oh, Big Man bought me a TV and said it was my window. This is what the world is. Be careful what you swallow. Freedom is a thing of the heart. But I wouldn't know anything about that now, would I? Big Man says sex is vile, and girls bleed to remind humanity of that fact. So he stays away when I bleed, says he wouldn't wish to partake in my curse. I had a dream last night, and I never dream. I saw my flesh and bones turn to pure light. Then I woke up with a scream. I broke the TV into a million pieces and set the whole room on fire. Got tired of Big Man's whispers, so I set myself on fire. Freedom is a thing at the heart, but I wouldn't know anything about that now, would I?
Thank you all, and thank you also to the artist Joa for this contribution. It's really powerful words to end the conversation on. It's been a powerful hour and a half. with this community. And I hope that that those who are part of this conversation, that it won't end today, that you'll continue to attend and participate and ask questions and engage in the remaining sessions of this festival today, tomorrow, and Friday. Thank you again and have a wonderful day. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to the interpreters for ensuring this space is accessible and available to a range of our community members. Thank you for the support team behind this work and that has enabled this work to be possible. Have a wonderful day. Bye.